Hi, it's Katrina. Number 10. The Windebee Bog Bodies. Near the town of Windebee in the north of Germany, some locals were cutting peat from a bog for fuel. They got quite the surprise when they discovered a body. They stopped working immediately and reported it to the authorities. At the time, they believed the mummified body that they found in the bog was that of a teenage girl, and she was therefore called the Windebee Girl. More recently, the body has been reevaluated, and experts now know that it's actually the mummified remains of a teenage boy. The story behind how this young man ended up buried in a bog is quite frankly horrifying. Unfortunately, when the mummy was found, the machine used to cut the peat had already done some damage. In fact, they had accidentally cut off one of its legs, a foot, and a hand. But still, the rest of the body was able to be removed relatively intact. There were no grave goods like what you would expect to find in such an ancient burial plot from nearly 2,000 years ago. But there was a strange band of wool covering the person's eyes, as well as a collar around their throat. He is now more formally known as the Windebee Bog Body. There were no signs of physical trauma, so we have no idea what happened to him. To make matters even more bizarre, a second body was later found nearby. It was a middle-aged man who had been strangled by a hazel branch and then placed in the bog on a stake. Clearly, something bad had happened here. At first, everyone thought perhaps this was an adulterous couple that had been punished and killed. But since now we know that both are male and they died 300 years apart, historians have interpreted the remains as belonging to Germanic tribes who punished people who committed crimes by executing them and then staking their bodies in the bog. Of course, all we know is how the man died, but we will probably never know the reason why. Today, you can see these remains of the bog bodies in a museum in Germany. Number 9. Stone Age Murder. Modern forensics and technology has just helped solve a murder mystery from the Stone Age. This is about as a cold case can get, unsolved for 33,000 years. The skull of the victim was first uncovered by miners working in Romania back in 1941. It was clear by a huge crack in the top of the skull that the man had been hit very hard with something in the head. Researchers with the Eberhard Karls University in Germany wanted to know what exactly caused the huge crack in his skull, so they recently did experimental trauma simulations. What this means is that they tested different scenarios, such as falling off a cliff, being hit with a stick, or being bludgeoned with a rock. The researchers were able to pin down the most likely scenario. They say that it was actually two injuries that caused the Paleolithic man to die. The first was a linear fracture at the base of his skull. The second was a depressed fracture on the side of his cranial vault. The injuries have proven to be from two consecutive blows with some kind of baseball bat-like object. Plus, researchers were able to determine by the positioning of the fractures that the confrontation was face-to-face. In other words, the killer was holding the weapon in their left hand and looking straight in the eyes of the victim just before they beat them to death. It definitely wasn't an accident, though of course it's impossible to come up with the motive 33,000 years after the fact. Number 8. Killed by tomb raiders. Archaeologists recently discovered the body of a Chinese man who had been stabbed to death and then dumped in a tunnel 1,300 years ago. The mystery came when archaeologists were excavating an ancient tomb in the northern Ningxiao region. They found the body of a man who was probably around 25 years old at the time of his death. His death was dated back to sometime between the years 640 and 680. Anthropologist Qian Wang from the Department of Biomedical Sciences at Texas A&M says the skeleton belonged to a healthy person. At least healthy until he was stabbed 13 times in the head, arms, and ribcage. Someone was really mad at this guy. Archaeologists found his remains slumped on the ground with his arms still covering his face in a last desperate bid to protect himself. Archaeologists were shocked, obviously dealing with an ancient murder, but judging by other evidence in the area, they were able to put together a strong hypothesis as to what happened. Because the man was discovered in a vertical shaft dug from the surface into the tomb by ancient tomb raiders, they believe that he was the unintended witness to a crime. He had likely stumbled upon the thieves as they were pillaging the tomb, and he surprised them. In the moment, the thieves killed him to ensure his silence. After the thieves finished stealing what they could from the grave, they threw the victim's body into the tunnel, and then filled it back up with soil. If he hadn't died from the stabbing, he most certainly died from being buried alive. Number 7. Dead in a cave. Archaeologists in the Scottish Highlands got another surprise when they discovered the skeleton of a man at the entrance of a cave they were excavating. He had been murdered about 1,500 years previously in the year 600 AD, and he had not died a quiet death. The first clue that he had been murdered came from the position of his body. He had just kind of been dumped into the cave with his legs crossed and heavy stones holding down his arms and legs. It was confusing because he had clearly been murdered, but then he was laid to rest inside the cave with a certain degree of consideration. Because of this, archaeologists say his murder may have been the result of interpersonal conflict or human sacrifice. Whatever the case, his death was brutal. According to Professor Dame Sue Black with Dundee University's Center for Anatomy and Human Identification, it took at least 5 blows to kill this man. Each blow resulted in an additional fracture to his skull. The first 3 impacts broke apart his teeth, fractured his left jaw, and broke the back of his skull. He was not going to go down peacefully. The 4th blow was probably meant to end his life. A weapon was driven through his skull from one side to the other. And finally, a 5th blow crushed the man's skull from the top. This is one of those murder mysteries that has yet to be solved. Nobody knows why he was killed, never mind in such a barbaric fashion. Number 6. Prehistoric Murder. Now it's time for the oldest murder victim ever discovered. This individual died 430,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia. We don't know if they were a man or a woman, why they were killed, or even that many details surrounding their death. We do know that they were killed by blunt force trauma to the head. Archaeologists discovered this skull in a cave in Spain in the Atapuerca Mountains. They were immediately alarmed because it was visibly obvious that the victim had had their skull bashed inward. But that wasn't the only scary aspect. To get to the remains, the archaeologists had to scramble down a skinny chimney into an underground cavern to find the skull. Inside the cavern was a pit of bones. At least 28 people were dead inside the pit, including members of various hominid species. There were members of the ancient Homo heidelbergensis and another species of human ancestor that scientists had never seen before. Today, this is one of the oldest burial pits ever found on the planet. It's also one of the only burial pits where different species of humans have been found in the same place. Nobody knows why the bodies were dumped here, what the timeline looks like, or why the victim of our ancient murder mystery had their head caved in. It's truly one of the real archaeological mysteries still waiting to be solved. Number 5. The New Mexico Massacre. 7 skeletons have been found in a secluded part of New Mexico deep inside a canyon, indicating there had been some type of massacre. The 5 adults, 1 child, and 1 infant were found to have been from the now extinct native Gallina culture. They occupied a small region of the southwestern state almost 1,000 years ago. But in the year 1275, they suddenly vanished, and all trace of them was lost. These skeletons, which were uncovered by the U.S. Forest Service in 2005, offer an explanation for what happened to these ancient people. According to Tony Larga Espada, the main researcher involved with the discovery, every single one of these people had been murdered, including the children. The bones had been shattered and broken apart, left behind in the dirt. Additionally, all the other skeletons that have been discovered in the area from the time of the Gallina also appeared to have been murdered. Archaeologists are now starting to suspect that there was not only a massacre here, but an ancient campaign of genocide in which every last member of the Gallina were wiped out in just a few years, maybe as quickly as a few months. Curiously enough, it appears that the Gallina disappeared around the same time as the Anasazi, who built Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Perhaps they were both wiped out by another culture who moved up from the south, like the Moche from Peru, whose gods were hungry for blood. Number 4. Murder by Hadrian's Wall. A young ancient victim was found at Hadrian's Wall in the United Kingdom. The child may very well have been killed some 1,800 years ago. According to the experts, this young person was either a child slave or the offspring of a soldier from mainland Europe, serving at this farthest outpost in the Roman Empire. Hadrian's Wall was built by the Romans when they occupied the United Kingdom. It marked the boundary of the Roman Empire, or as far as they would ever conquer. It was manned by Roman soldiers, with many of these soldiers coming from other parts of the empire. The body was found in a shallow pit at the corner of a back room at the old Roman fortress. Researchers immediately thought it was strange because most bodies were buried far away from settlements so that ordinary folk wouldn't be contaminated by the dead. Dr. Trudy Buck from Durham University was able to determine that the child was about 10, though no one knows if it was a boy or a girl. Dr. Buck also says this was definitely a case of murder, since the body appears to have been stashed rather than buried. Also, the skull has a distinct fracture that means the child was hit over the head with something heavy. DNA tests showed that the child came from the Mediterranean. That means they were either the child of a foreign soldier or a slave. Seeing as child slavery was huge business in ancient Rome, it wouldn't be surprising. It could be that the child's Roman owner got angry, killed the child, then stashed the body under the fort. Number 3. An ancient bullet. Sometime around 2,000 years ago, a man was murdered in Greece. The murderer killed this person by driving something very sharp into his chest. Archaeologists investigating the body believe it was a unique type of spear, driven into the man so hard that it left an almost perfect circle in his sternum, almost like an ancient bullet. The ancient weapon used in the murder was called a styrax. Anagnostis Aguilarakis from Adelphi University says that in 40 years of studying archaeology, they have never witnessed such a perfect wound on any remains. They say that the spear was thrust at a close range with immaculate precision, stabbed straight through the sternum. So who was the person who got killed? He was tall for the day, standing 5'7". He was also about 50 years old and was extraordinarily muscular. It remains a mystery why he was killed, though seeing as this was ancient Greece, it probably had something to do with political upheaval. The real fascinating part is the wound in his chest. After doing experiments with the physics department, Anagnostis discovered that it would have taken about 500 pounds of pure force to pierce the man's sternum. Even though the victim was quite buff, whoever killed him was an absolute beast. Number 2. Mass cannibalism. In the ancient village of Herxheim in modern-day Germany, about 7,000 years ago, hundreds of people were butchered. They were likely ritually sacrificed, eaten by other humans, and then had their remains thrown into a pit. According to anthropologists from the University of Bordeaux in France, the sudden explosion of cannibalism could have had something to do with ritual sacrifice. But this wasn't a friendly ritual sacrifice. The cannibals at the village may have brought slaves or prisoners of war back to their settlement before brutally murdering and eating them. But these villagers weren't the only ones eating other people. Cannibalism was fairly common in the early Neolithic period in Europe. This was around the time that farming started to spread across the continent. Villages would often fight against others for whatever reason, then take their bodies back home to eat. Archaeologists know this because of markings on the skeletons, indicating that they had been butchered in the exact same way as animals. However, it's impossible to say exactly what happened at Herxheim. It was definitely cannibalism, but the motive is still up in the air. Whatever happened was extreme, since archaeologists have never before found so many cannibalized victims killed in the same brief span of time. Number 1. The Death Pit. 8,000 years ago, a woman around the age of 19, along with a man slightly older than her, fell into a well. Either that, or they were pushed. Archaeologists are calling it a Stone Age murder mystery. Nobody can tell whether the couple fell by accident or if foul play was involved. It does seem a little strange that 2 people would fall into a well purely by accident. 1 would be understandable, but 2 really makes you wonder. The couple lived during the Stone Age in what is today Israel. The well is still around all these years later, near the ancient settlement of Enot Nisanit. The well itself is 26 feet deep, made completely out of stone sunken into the bedrock. At its mouth, the well gapes 4 feet wide. The 2 skeletons were not the only things that archaeologists found inside the well. They also uncovered tools, ancient garbage, and bones from animals. It appears that after the people fell into the well or were pushed, the villagers stopped using it to drink out of and turned it into a garbage dump. Even 8,000 years ago, people knew that dead bodies and fresh drinking water didn't mix. But unfortunately, there is really no way to tell if these people were killed by some evil villain. It is possible that they were murdered, pushed into the well to contaminate the water on purpose, or it could be that somebody was trying to make the entire village sick. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. See you next time. Bye!